Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final session of Virtually 2023. Thank you to all of our speakers that have spoken so far this week. It's been a great week. We're going to have all the recordings of this week's sessions available on our YouTube channel shortly after the conference ends, a little bit later on today. As mentioned previously, MyClearText are providing live captions. You can access these either by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom window, or alternatively, I've just dropped a stream text link into the chat for a fully adjustable page of captions. So finally, for this week, we have our panel who will be introduced shortly. And this panel is all about accessibility in the education sector. The panel will cover the current state of web accessibility in this sector, the legal and ethical obligations of educational institutions in ensuring they're accessible, and the challenges and opportunities for providing web accessibility in education. As always, please do get involved in the discussion and say hello in the chat. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuned in from. Just make sure your chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees, and that way everyone can see your messages. Also, if you've got any questions, please do submit them. Alastair will run through those at the end. So yeah, over to you, Alastair.
Thanks, Henry. And yeah, some quick introductions. I'm Alastair Campbell from Nomensa. I'm basically a host of this panel. So we'll start off with Jade.
Hi everyone, my name is Jade Matos Carew and I'm Head of Digital Accessibility and Usability at the Open University in the UK.
Great. And Janell.
Hey there, I'm Janell Sims. I'm a Manager of Digital Accessibility Services at Harvard University in Cambridge, Mass. in the US.
And Anthony.
Hey, I'm Anthony Fernando. I'm a strategic leader in digital accessibility in the education sector. I'm based in Denver, Colorado.
Great, thank you. So for this session, we're going to run through a lot of the sort of very educational sector specific aspects of accessibility, but we don't want to make too many assumptions about what people watching know or don't know about the sector. So just to give us a kind of a taster and an introduction, what are the kind of biggest issues for students that you tend to come across day to day in your roles? And Jade, should we start with you?
Okay, I'm going to sidetrack a little bit from pure accessibility. One of the issues that I think is really important is making sure that students are well equipped in terms of digital literacy. So really making sure that students have sustained and available training for how they can use and explore assistive technology on their own. Because there's a lot out there. There's a lot of free software. There's a lot of paid for assistive tech as well. But I think there's so much scope for exploring assistive tech and what it can do. But what we see is that students often don't know that it exists, or the training is perhaps insufficient, or it doesn't last very long. So yeah, that's something that I think sits alongside digital accessibility, is the importance of digital literacy.
Okay, so basically on the kind of student end, them knowing about what they can use to help make, you know, everything easier for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, that goes hand in hand with making sure that we have accessible systems that are really well looked after, because without that, of course, the assistive tech is often meaningless. But it could be a real enabler. And I think there's a lot of exciting developments for kind of inbuilt accessibility on mobile technology, for example, and yeah, all of the freebies that you can download. There's so much to explore. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Janell, you can bring a US perspective to this as well.
Yeah, thanks. So our office is still relatively new. We've only been around for 3 years, and so far the focus that we've had at the beginning has been on public-facing websites and really supporting staff and faculty. So we don't have as much experience directly with students, but from what we can tell, from what we hear from staff, what we hear from faculty, and the reported accessibility concerns that come in, we know that students do have a lot of times difficulty accessing course materials. There's been a lot of like scanned PDFs that have been used over and over the years, you know, just sort of like mindlessly, just like posting PDFs, so those can be really difficult. And something we've been noticing a lot lately is interactive tools, especially as things are more virtual. A lot of whiteboarding and collaborative tools, which can be really cool and exciting, but a lot of times there's not accessibility thoughtfully built in from the beginning. So those can be some issues, but I really agree with what Jade said. I think the more education that we do, and we've just started using a tool that converts files to other formats, so it could be a little easier. So just trying to get the word out to students that, if there is something they're having a barrier with, there might be ways to work around it, but then ideally we want to build those accessibility materials from the beginning.
And Anthony, give us a bit of your background and what you've found in terms of the sort of biggest issues for students.
Yeah, I've been into accessibility for 13 years. So I've seen quite a lot of outdated applications out there, makes a lot of barriers for people with disabilities, especially for students. I know it's a common issue everywhere, but in terms of education, it has become quite a challenge. So in students' words, it's boring, it's not interactive, right? In other words, it's not giving them a delightful experience to learn. Most of them are developed on top of outdated technology, is part of the reason why they're inaccessible. We can't even think of making them accessible because of their technology itself, that barrier itself. So we probably need to get rid of that in some sometime later on, at least. So some of them have poorly designed user interfaces that definitely need an upgrade. So it's really bad in color contrast, bad in keyboard accessibility, so many barriers. And in terms of cognitive disabilities, it's even harder if someone wants to access those kind of applications.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a few projects with universities, and the thing that always surprises me is just how much surface area there is in terms of number of websites, number of courses, the materials within the courses. The surface area that education deals with is just so massive. So when you start talking about we've got outdated systems, I can just imagine, they were purchased like 10 years ago, maybe have a little ongoing license, and it would just be such a massive job to upgrade everything. Does that ring a bell with anyone?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so lots of challenges, lots of surface area to deal with. From an institutional point of view, what are the sort of big challenges for actually trying to solve those problems? We'll start with Janell.
Well, I think over the past few years, we've really tried hard to promote education and just awareness about accessibility. And I think people are really at the point where they really do care. I feel like that part of the journey where we're trying to get people to even care at all it's definitely not done, but we've definitely made progress there. So that's usually not the hardest part, is trying to convince people that it's important. People understand that it is. They really want to be inclusive, but I think they just start to get overwhelmed with well, what do I do and how do I do it? It seems, sometimes I feel like accessibility seems like this big technical problem, well, I'm not a developer, I don't know how to fix this, or it's just such a big and expensive problem too. Is this a new thing we're going to have to budget for? Alastair, like we were saying, there's expansive systems, how are we even going to get started? So I think people just get really overwhelmed. And reality is, there's just such simple steps that people can take. And so that's really what we try to focus on. It's you don't have to fix everything all at once. Just start small, start today, start small. But that's sort of the biggest challenge, I think, is just calming people and helping them not to get overwhelmed.
Yeah, and I guess it's it's a case of, I mean, as you know, Jade mentioned, the part of the barrier is users knowing, you know, the best ways for them to use their technology, and then you've got this whole multi-dimensional problem-solving space, because you need to know what the users have, you need to know what the authors are working with, and trying to marry those things up. And presumably it's different, like in every department, with every different tool, with all this multiplicity of things. Anthony, how about you? What are the biggest challenges for the institutions?
Yeah, so even though I say like outdated inaccessibility applications are bad, it's harder to get rid of, because it still makes a good amount of revenue for these companies. And on the other side, even institutions, they don't want to, switch that, kind of applications, anytime soon as well, because there are a lot of students. It has been kind of a, thing that they have already, working very comfortable on those kind of applications. It's really hard to, come up with new applications, because it also creates more barriers, like, so that if you want to make a investment, like, it's not that easy to do that, to discontinue a legacy product, right? And or upgrading an interface, it's it requires so much of investment. Someone needs to make a bold decision to get that done. It's not only the companies, it has to be from institutions as well, like both of them to agree on a timeline, on a big investments. As Janell mentioned, we need to start somewhere, small steps at least, right? And so one of the things is, like, they need to realize, like, there's a declining in sales, or there's a legal obligations to at least to start this, right? Otherwise, if there's no pushback from students, or there's no legal requirement or declining in sales, it's not happening.
Yeah, I guess and there's always, there must be some kind of balance or calculation in mind when people are thinking, this application's not very accessible, maybe we have to put accommodations in place for some of our students, which is an ongoing cost, versus the cost of replacing that system, which then is maybe quite high, and you've got one of those decisions for every system that's used, probably. Jade, how about, what are the challenges you've seen?
I think there are three distinct areas of challenge that I can think of right now. One of them you've already kind of mentioned, this grappling with such large digital estates that are full of complex systems, perhaps legacy systems. How do we manage those, and where do we draw a line in the sand from, well, okay, we need to decommission that, or we need to update this. And I think that that's set against different landscapes in terms of legislation. So obviously over in the States, you've got kind of quite mature legislation in terms of digital accessibility. And in the UK, ours is more recent. So institutions are kind of grappling with what this legislation means. It was brought in 2018. So prior to that, we had some preparation time. However, kind of since then, we've been operating in learning about how this legislation actually operates in reality. What does it mean? What kind of things do we need to think of when we're thinking in terms of government audits and compliance? So institutions often grapple with this and how it sits alongside managing complex digital estates. I think also awareness raising for all staff. This is one of the most difficult things. And making all staff aware that we can't just go off and create websites all over the show, that there are governance aspects that we need to consider. And sometimes getting that message out there and raising awareness of the kind of fundamentals of creating digital content and systems and websites, it can be a bit like herding cats, trying to get everybody to follow guidance and be a bit more vocal about when they're making things, and getting in touch with accessibility staff in institutions to make sure that they're doing the right thing. But a lot of that, a lot of the way to solving some of those issues is making sure that accessibility is resourced properly. So it shouldn't be considered as an add-on, just an add-on to somebody's role. Really, it should, senior management at the upper echelons of institutions really need to be considering how they're resourcing accessibility, and making sure that we have trained staff who have opportunities for continued professional development, and that they're well equipped to do their roles on an institutional level.
And just that kind of level of complexity as well, I think then seems to multiply when you're considering accessibility. So if you had PDFs is a great example of this, as somebody mentioned earlier, where because anyone can create a PDF from any kind of source format, there is massive variation in the accessibility of those. Whereas if you're using a website through a content management system, there's much less variation and it's much easier to deal with as a central team. So the more diversity in technology you have, the more resourcing for accessibility you probably need, I think. And you started touching on the sort of how to deal with those problems. So what are the most effective things that people have tried? Anthony, what would you pick on as the sort of most effective things?
I would say getting the leadership buy-in is very important, like top to bottom approach, because unless your leaders are not on board, if they don't have accessibility in their vision, it's very hard thing to get it done throughout the organization. So getting them to understand the risk of having inaccessible products in terms of user dissatisfaction or legal escalation is very important. If you think of the 15% of the world population, we can still apply to the customer base. It's a huge number in terms of a large application. So you probably need to think about loss of revenue, loss of opportunities for these companies. So I think leadership buying is very important.
Okay. And Jade, what have you tried?
So one of the aspects to my role is to try and find creative and innovative ways to educate people about digital accessibility. And I'm really lucky at the Open University because we have so many wonderful and committed staff members who work really hard in all areas of accessibility. But we have kind of such a wide range of staff, and everybody to some extent needs knowledge of digital accessibility. So trying to, instead of maybe just signposting to guidance, I think there's an element of hand-holding to help people use that guidance and access it in the first place. So we often try creative approaches to empower, I was going to say learners, to empower staff members to learn about accessibility in their own time. For example, a couple of months ago, we had a month-long, we called it a fix-a-thon, and it was a document fixing month. And we paired up staff members from around the Open University as accountability partners, and we set them off with some tasks to go and update their documents, giving them guidance and support along the way. But it really kind of, it made staff members a bit more autonomous in their learning, which we hope made it resonate a little bit more. Instead of just being fed, learning, they were actually taking it a more proactive approach to learning for themselves. So we're always trialing lots of kind of like smaller ideas. I think we had 30 pairs of fixathon partners that went through that whole process. So that's what, 70 people who learned about document accessibility, and we're hoping that from there they recommend it to colleagues, and we can repeat the exercise in future. So yeah, so innovative and creative ways to helping staff learn about accessibility.
Yeah, and I've noticed, I started in accessibility over 20 years ago, but people do appreciate how to use their digital tools better now, whereas previously it was maybe sort of in the early days, from my point of view, it was much more of a, people kind of considered it the computer thing, but now, everyone has their phones, and it's a very kind of mainstream thing, so people appreciate it more, which is lucky and a good thing. Janelle, how about you?
Yeah, Jade, I love that idea of the fixathon. We may borrow/steal that.
Credit the Open University with the name Fixathon, because it's a really good one.
Yeah, that's awesome. But yeah, that goes to kind of what we've been trying to focus on too, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier with people being overwhelmed with too much to do. Just really trying to emphasize that no step is too small. Like nothing you do is too small, even if it's just fixing one link, adding alt text to one image, like just such a small step will have such a big impact. We don't want people to say like, well, I'll just work on accessibility this summer when I have more time, or like put it off as like a big project. Don't think of it as like one big thing you just have to sit down and do. It's like a small little actions that you do every single day. And the best time to get started is right now. So just kind of trying to focus on that.
The kind of tree planting analogy, I think.
Exactly. Best time was 20 years ago, but second best time is right now.
I just wanted to add on that. The idea of quick wins is really important, because not only are they easy and quick to do, it also means that people can see the result of something quite quickly as well, and that then further motivates people to do more. So yeah, we're all about the kind of quick and easy. What can we do over here at the OU as well?
Yeah, doing it as you go along is really important. So I'm going to be more awkward and maybe slightly put you on the spot in terms of other things you have tried that you thought would work, but they didn't turn out to be very effective. Jade, I'll pick on you first.
I think I touched on it earlier. I mean, it's nothing disastrous, but the idea that signposting to guidance alone isn't sufficient for staff. So you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So we've found that it's not very effective to just go, here's how you make a PowerPoint accessible. Like, look at that thorough guidance that we've created for you. There's more scaffolding that's needed and more support to initially access that guidance in the first place. So yeah, I think we've learned that through kind of the past few years of creating kind of bespoke resources for the OU. And what does and doesn't work, and how people respond to and react to those resources. When we produce our resources for staff at the OU, we do it in two ways. We create more bespoke guidance, but we also sign out to resources. And as part of that, we like to curate those resources and really explain what they're for, when they were last updated. So almost looking after it a bit like an archive. And that's another way to kind of demonstrate how we're committed to education at the OU. But yeah, something that didn't work, just not enough support for producing guidance, maybe.
I think that's also an easy mistake for us who work in accessibility to make, because we tend to hoover up, accessibility guidance and new things and articles and anything we can get our hands on.
There's so much of it. There's so much. Like, it almost feels like the internet is saturated with accessibility guidance and knowing what's good and what's bad. If you were just starting out in accessibility, it must be quite overwhelming to have access to so many resources. It's a really good thing, and that motivation is wonderful. But there's just so much out there. It must be.
I mean, if it's not somebody's primary job, like for us, then this is an additional thing rather than something you want to hoover up. Janelle, how about you?
Yeah, I totally agree. Like we've had that same exact thing of like, how much is too much information that we're providing? Like we want to give just enough, but not too much that it's overwhelming. And we've really tried to focus on the resources that we provide. We're trying to focus on the content itself and trying to make our guidance what we call platform agnostic. So it doesn't matter if you're posting on a website or a course platform or like a Slack or an email or creating a document. It doesn't matter, like all of the same accessibilities still apply, but people still kind of get overwhelmed with that. And people still kind of have this thought of like, I want to find something that is literally for my job. So I'm a staff assistant. What do I need to do? I'm a faculty assistant. What do I need to do? So we've been hearing a lot of feedback about that. So we've been kind of repackaging, like it's the same content, but we'll kind of repackage it. And you're like, here's if you have an academic role, here's if you're a staff role, and here's your faculty. And I think that's been helpful just so that they can sort of see the same content in a different lens. But exactly what Jade said too, it's like, we can create all the content we want, but unless we like help people understand how to use it and where it is, it really just can be very overwhelming.
I mean, that's something I've found in my sort of practice, which is usually with commercial organizations, but we might create sort of customized guidance for particular roles within an organization, which is useful, but then it's also good to do a kind of a socialization session or two where it's almost like a handover where we run through the guidance and we get people to think about how they use it in their day-to-day sort of work, and then it works better. It's not perfect yet, but certainly that's been better than throwing a document over the wall. I was just interested, Janelle, because you were talking about making the guidance platform agnostic. Did that make it more difficult to people? Did you have to customize it for maybe the system they were using to get them to really engage?
No, we've tried not to do that just because there's so many systems at Harvard, and everybody uses so many different ones. So, we figured if we created like one, it would throw people off who don't use that. We did, however, just recently created a specialized kind of content training and resources for the learning platform that we use, Canvas. So we have like a special session just for Canvas users, which again, it's basically our same content creator training. We just put the word Canvas on there and added a few extra screenshots and like a special little how-to on how to add certain content in Canvas. But so that has been helpful and it's been very, very popular. But that's the only like specialized platform or system that we've focused on so far.
Okay. Yeah, well, I do appreciate, the variety of systems you have. Maybe we'll come on to a solution for that later. Anthony, how about you? Anything you thought might work but didn't?
Yeah, probably training programs. Everyone conducts them a lot. I think Jade and Janell also touched. So role-based approach is a good one, and it helps companies tremendously. However, unless we make a cultural shift, I personally believe like we can't, resolve the accessibility problem. And why I say this, like unless we, make them, like into action in all part of the organization and all part of the process, it's going to be a difficult task to, achieve, a holistic, accessible ecosystem, right? And we need to think about this big, as a big picture. Like I'm talking about the big picture here. Like hiring people with disabilities to work directly with the team members. So that itself, creates a difference in the culture, and embedding accessibility in major milestones of the process, right? That also makes a huge impact. We need to create sparks around all parts of the organization, so that it's not just only our duty, it's part of other non-accessibility employees' duty as well, because it's engaging, it's a holistic thing to do. What I also think is, like, we need more conversions of people other than in the industry thinking about accessibility, right? We need more people as well in the accessibility industry. So, like, awareness is good, but we need to have a kind of a cultural shift, in my opinion, to get this resolved. It's a huge task, but we need to put that spark from top to bottom.
I've certainly found it easier to sort of motivate teams to make accessibility changes when it's obvious that some of their colleagues are affected, or just people that they know. So yeah, hiring that's a sort of good way of trying to improve that situation.
Yeah, so one point, like, that also helps others who are non-disabled, or if not having any disability, see their lifelong struggles. Like, they really understand how they do things, in terms of perspective. I think that's really important factor. They get to talk to them, and they have so many myths, so they can get rid of those myths, like talking to these people. Yeah.
And sorry, a slightly unplanned question, but one of the big themes for me is just this sheer variety of authors, people creating materials, systems that you've got, diversity of students. One of the things that's kind of been quite successful on the government side is providing some central resources. So GDS in the UK, Government Digital Service in the UK, provide a well-tested set of components and a kind of pattern library for different departments to use. And what we found as people helping those departments with accessibility is, if they're using those and using them properly with the accessibility advice that goes with them, they start from a much better place. Are there any similar things you're aware of more in the education space, where are there kind of shared learning management systems or open source learning management systems, or things which have this sort of accessibility focus that work between organizations? Or is this currently a foreign concept because every university likes to create their own thing? Jade, do you want to, has that sparked any ideas for you?
I think sometimes we can be guilty of being quite protective over what we create in institutions. But one thing that's really positive in the UK certainly is there are quite a few mailing lists that are really popular, and they're well used and they're well referenced. And there's the one in particular in the UK is the DISC, Digital Accessibility Mailing List, and lots of people access this, contribute, and I think that has the potential for some really decent sharing of resources. So just offering opportunities to connect a bit more. However, there are things that that really are kind of only relevant to a particular institution. And thinking of component libraries and things like that. For Global Accessibility Awareness Day today, my team gifted the Open University a set of student accessibility profiles, and they're kind of similar to personas. However, we didn't want to kind of boil down personas just to one or two people. We went for profiles instead. And they took us in the region of about a year to put together, and they're based on direct research with students, a wonderful resource. We're so proud of them. It's been an absolute labour of love for the past year. But the reason, there's nothing I'd love more than to be able to release them publicly and shout about them from the rooftops. However, they might not make sense to a wider audience because they're based on students at the Open University who are have a quite particular kind of set of circumstances, perhaps as distance learning students, online distance learning students a lot of the time. So perhaps some resources are best kept just at an institutional level rather than being shared more widely.
Okay, well, music to my ears in terms of based on direct research. That's so many of these things tend to be sort of invented from people's heads. So yes, no, that sounds good. Any other thoughts on that side of things? Where are there any sort of shared resources in the US, Janell?
I think kind of like Jade said, people are very protective. There's some real competition among universities, especially in the Ivy League. So there is a group called Ivy League Plus, where a bunch of people from higher ed and related universities will get together and share ideas. But as far as like programs and things like that, to my knowledge, is like definitely not shared among universities. In fact, even at Harvard, it's hard to get people to share things like in different schools and departments and things. So, but I mean, I do like that idea, and maybe going forward, we can try to think more about that.
Okay, so last sort of main question then, and we've got a few questions from the audience coming in. It's kind of one of my big bugbears, whether the lack of education about accessibility impacts the accessibility of education. And just to explain that slightly, I've run a lot of training for various organizations on digital accessibility, and the number of people who come to that having done anything about accessibility previously is 10%, maybe 20 or 30% if it's the BBC or some public sector organization. But for me, that seems like the biggest and ongoing problem. I was wondering what you thought about that aspect, and whether that's something that education can tackle to start with. Janell.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I love thinking about this. Because if you think about it, if instructors aren't educated about accessibility, if they don't really know how to present accessibly, they're not going to be inclusive in their teaching practices. So in the classroom, they might not embody or practice accessibility because they just don't know, not for lack of wanting or caring. And that means that all students aren't receiving the equitable experience. So especially students with disabilities. But I think it's a real opportunity for instructors if we could educate them on best practices, if they sort of started to model good accessibility practices in the classroom and in their course materials. It would not only create an equitable and inclusive education experience for everybody, but it would also encourage the students if they receive all these like accessible materials, or if they notice the instructor describing visuals on the board or in a video, they might start incorporating that in their own work. So next time they create a PDF, like, oh, maybe I should make this accessible, or maybe I should describe something that's visual that doesn't have a text alternative. So just maybe starting and with the instructors, I think that's a great opportunity to kind of trickle down into the student experience as well.
Anthony, how about you? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I have realized that awareness is the biggest challenge for accessibility. Like if you talk to outside of accessibility community, some even don't know about accessibility, even that exists. Not something that it's a feature that you can add later on. So we need to have a 360 approach, for accessibility. Accessibility is a journey from the start. All should be responsible for accessibility. I think we need more people in the accessibility industry. So we need more GADs like this. So this is really great. I'm really happy that this is, from one day it has become a weekly practice. So that's really great. So awareness, as Janell and Jade said, also it's really important for me.
And Jade, how about you?
So one thing that I think is so important, I think universities are such large places. There's so many staff members, and I think traditionally we might have, and of course quite rightly, focused on the teaching and learning side of accessibility, and perhaps forgotten that we need to think in a more holistic way. So there are, of course, so many teaching and learning staff and academics, but what about the people in the background, the people working in recruitment, finance, like all of these kind of areas that are a bit more hidden and a bit less visible? They need to know about accessibility too, because if they're not being accessible in their practices and their everyday ways of working, everybody needs to be doing this. So I think that perhaps some more focus on the kind of job roles at universities that don't have direct interaction with students. I think we should be paying a lot more attention there, just so we can embed best practice in accessibility in a much more thorough way.
And I guess it's not necessarily going to be something they thought about or previously has been part of their role. So it's probably also to do with providing them the right tools in terms of how to, create things. But I mean, one of the reasons for the question was that, as I mentioned in the training I do, if the course materials for teaching design and computer science and things like those, if those were accessible themselves and used accessible examples. I mean, a friend of mine who's blind went through an Open University course. This is a few years ago, so don't worry, Jade. But she was blind and did computer science, and many of their examples were just, they were teaching inaccessible examples essentially, and that's I would assume that's going to be the default in most places, most courses, because they're very focused on, we're teaching this concept and accessibility is this separate thing, whereas it needs to be, teach that concept, but do that in an accessible way. Even if you're not focusing on the accessibility of it, just don't teach people bad habits, because that to me is what seems to come through. So if we could get designer and developer training as or teaching in higher education and basically throughout to include accessibility at every step, that would be something you don't have to unlearn and then relearn later. So that would eventually feed into the products that universities buy, because they would be outputting good designers and developers who then create better products for the universities to buy. So there's almost like a loop going on here. But then going back to Janell's point, it feels almost like we need almost like a reset to get over this chicken and egg, and just pick a year, say for that year we're going to work really hard on all the resources across all these courses so that everyone gets used to it, and then it goes up from that year onwards. Pick a cohort and it goes up from there. We've got a few questions coming in from the audience, but did anyone have anything you wanted to add just based on the discussion?
I've just got one thing to add to that. I think it's important to remember that educators are often choosing resources, not just making their own. And I think empowering educators to be able to assess the accessibility of resources is really, really important, especially when we're using kind of third-party software and teaching and collaborative tools. A lot of the questions that my team get asked are, look, I want to use this in a tutorial. Like, is it accessible? So we need to either be ready to answer those questions, but because there are so many of them, maybe the answer is to empower them to assess the accessibility of those tools themselves.
So Alastair, I got also one thing. So we also need to make research a priority, and it's something that institution companies cannot do alone. Like there are quite a number of good researching companies, especially on interactive components. So in my state, University of Colorado Boulder, they have this interactive simulations. They create accessibility simulations. So it's called the PHET project, PHET. So there are several other companies doing such things. So we need to engage with them quite often to get more interactive accessibility into these educational applications.
Yeah, that almost borders on the sort of games technology, doesn't it? When you're looking at things like VR and XR, and I mean, the one ray of hope. I follow somebody on Twitter called Ian Hamilton, who's very into game accessibility, and he retweets lots of things about game accessibility, and it does seem to be something that industry is paying a lot more attention to now, and I think that bodes well because there's quite a lot of overlap between interactive games and educational kind of materials as well. I often see games as like the hardest thing from an accessibility point of view. It's like the real most difficult things to make accessible, and if you can do it there, then doing it in sort of other types of educational materials would be seen as much more feasible. Any other thoughts before I go on to the questions? No? Okay, one from Natasha. So she asked, there are so many platforms to create online learning contents, yet it's very hard to find those which are accessible. Is there a list somewhere of the most accessible platforms, agreeing on the fact that the contents will then need to be made accessible too? So does anyone know about where or how you find the sort of accessible online learning materials?
Accessible online learning materials or platforms?
Or sorry, platforms to create online learning materials.
The Web Accessibility Initiative, the W3C, has a list of accessible authoring tools, I think.
Oh yes. Yeah, the accessible authoring tools might be a little out of date. I mean,
they've just
have they just updated it?
They've either just updated or it's about to be released. Yeah, forgive me, I can't off the top of my head remember which is correct. But they, of course, also produce the kind of ATAG standards as well, don't they? So, yeah.
I worked on that one. It came out in 2012. Yes, it's useful. I don't know how much do you get suppliers who mention that, or is it one of the questions during that kind of procurement?
I think that suppliers can list their authoring tools on that. They can list it. I don't think there's a I don't think there's a requirement to like list absolutely every detail of whether they're compliant or what they do. Yeah, you'll have to forgive me. I don't know a great deal about it. I just know that there is definitely a list there, and it's either just been updated or is in the process of being published.
Right. Janell, do you get involved in the procurement side much?
We do, not so much on the learning platforms. Like you said, we use Canvas, and we've worked a lot with the vendor to try to make that platform as accessible as possible, with the note that now it's our job to educate people who create materials to make sure they're accessible as well. But on the larger, because we do kind of like what Jade was saying earlier about working with the other staff members outside of even the academic and education, there's so many other systems and vendors that we work with, like just project management vendors, collaboration tool vendors, just lots and lots of vendors. And procurement is always tricky because every single vendor will always say, yes, absolutely, we're accessible. We will definitely build you a WCAG compliant site. Absolutely. And the amount of times when we have seen that just they don't ever have a plan for how they're going to do it. They're just like, yes, we'll do it, no problem. So it's a matter of like taking it kind of with a grain of salt and really doing your own research, finding out their experience, creating products in the past, making sure those are accessible, and really finding out, drilling down and finding out what is your plan? Like, how do you incorporate accessibility from the beginning in your process? So that's kind of what the questions we've been asking vendors. And that's another part of education too, is helping staff like in the finance department or in the admissions department understand how to ask those questions from vendors.
Yeah, I attended an event where we had some people from JISC speaking, I think, and they were on talking about procurement. And from my point of view, it was interesting. They focused on what asking questions about the process by which the vendor would ensure it was accessible, rather than just asking, is it accessible? Because, and then if the vendor just answered, yeah, it's fine, then that was a black mark. Whereas if it was a sort of detailed response that was more nuanced and sort of acknowledged that there are likely to be issues, but this is how we solve them, that was a much better response from their point of view. Procurement, that particularly in educational establishments, I think is definitely one to focus on.
Sorry, I was just going to add, I don't think people realise just how many kind of IT solutions institutions buy, whether it's kind of centrally or even things like library resources, publishers like Journal, all of it all needs procuring. And it's massive. It's a whole like load of jobs in itself to look after accessibility and procurement. But one of the things that we advise is you can tell a lot about a supplier by just going on their homepage and running a couple of quick tests. So that's what we would advise to see whether they are actually walking the walk.
Yeah, definitely. We had a question from Jock saying the population of elderly people in the USA is expanding enormously, as is the universe of people with dementia who are digitally abandoned. Can you point to any websites whose audience is people with disabilities, not how to recognize dementia, but websites for people with dementia? Such sites are very, very simple. Which I think is a very specific question on websites for dementia. The only one I could mention would be have a look at, I think it's the Alzheimer's Society in the UK. I know we've worked with, and they're very intent on making it better for people with Alzheimer's, as well as for sort of recognizing symptoms and that kind of thing. But I don't know if anyone else has any suggestions on that question.
Not off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
No, I think that's probably a little bit outside of our topical area of expertise at the moment. And then one person
I would like to say is like instead of just focusing on dementia, let's probably try to focus on cognitive abilities. In that case, you could broaden that segment and look for something, right? That's where I'm thinking we should proceed, and especially with WCAG 2.2 coming in, like there'll be more things coming with that as well. But I would definitely say look for that broader spectrum.
Obviously, there's AbilityNet in the UK that provides a lot of support for digital literacy in older people. So they might have some useful resources on their website. And I'd imagine that you've got a US equivalent of that organisation.
I'm sure we do. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but I was just going to say too, it may not be like something you think of all the time, but when it comes to higher ed, we actually have an enormous elderly population because of all of our alumni. So like our alumni site, really, we try to really be focused on people with cognitive issues and like an aging population, because that's a huge part of our audience.
Yeah, and it's almost as though, well, yeah, all sites should be sort of usable for people with cognitive disabilities of various forms. In practice, sometimes, you know, the topical area might sort of get in the way of that a little bit, in terms of, we also work with a publisher of physics journals, and they do struggle with plain English quite a lot. But I would also point people to the cognitive, making content usable for people with cognitive and learning disabilities, which is a big document from W3C, but it's quite a good summary of a lot of different research into that whole area. So that's kind of my go-to resource if I'm looking to find out, you know, what design patterns would work for somebody with memory issues, for example. And also Natasha in the comments mentioned the easy read method, which is, if you just look up easy read, it's a almost like a translation. So if you've got a complicated document, it can be translated into easy read, which is a little kind of picture and some very plain language text next to it, which some of our government clients use quite a lot, because it's a way of conveying information kind of very effectively and understandably. It would be lovely to do that sort of more holistically around sites, but it does make them very hard to maintain, I think, if you went completely down that method. And then
Gov.uk is a really decent example of like readable language and using plain English across a digital estate. So yeah.
Sorry, who was that? I missed the first bit.
Kind of gov.uk sites. Yeah, we use them as an exemplar quite a lot.
Yeah, the US has plainlanguage.gov. They have lots of great resources.
Yeah, and I think that they almost required in some areas as well, for US government institutions, which is good. Okay, very last question then. What is the best way to learn about making online platforms / CMSs accessible? Any thoughts?
I think, well, using those ATAG guidelines, but I know those are kind of difficult to parse. But as far as training, I mean, I think that kind of best practices apply, like learning about building accessibly, developing accessibly will go a long way. Again, you know, the same accessibility principles apply, making sure that there's accessible names and roles and things are interactive, you know.
The first half of ATAG basically says, look at WCAG and do that. If you're doing an online, system, that is a good place to start. So Henry, should we wrap up there? Are we out of time now?
Yeah, I think just about. Yeah, thank you everyone. That was amazing. What an awesome panel, and yeah, just thanks so much for your insight, and a massive thanks to everyone who has joined us over the course of the week. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure hosting virtually, and we will certainly be back at the same time next year. If anyone watching needs any accessibility advice, please do get in touch with us here at Nomensa. We also have got lots of accessibility content on the Nomensa blog, YouTube channel and website, and also a free accessibility assessment tool which analyzes your organization's digital accessibility capability. So we'll be sharing links for those shortly on our social channels. And for everyone based in the UK, our Bristol conference Collaborate is taking place on the 16th of June. It's a conference that focuses on collaboration and design. There's still a few tickets left, and we would love to see you there. So again, thank you to all of you. That was a great panel. Thanks again to all our speakers who took part this week. And yeah, we'll see you again next year. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.